The tension in Port Charles had a way of seeping into the smallest corners of everyday life, but nowhere did it press down more heavily than in the courtroom where Willow now sat, fingers twisted together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The air was thick with whispers, with the rustle of legal files and the sharp scrape of chair legs on polished floors. On paper, this was a legal proceeding about a shooting, about guilt and innocence, about the evidence that could make or break a life. But to Willow, it felt more like a trial of her heart, of every decision she had made since the day she agreed to tie her future to Drew Kane. She had thought the worst was over when the testimony ended, when the lawyers finally stopped saying her name like it was a problem to solve. She had no idea that Drew was about to stand up and drop a bomb she hadn't prepared for, at least, not emotionally. It happened in a moment so quiet it almost felt unreal. Drew rose from his chair at the defense table, straightening his tie more out of habit than necessity. The courtroom, already keyed up, seemed to hold its breath. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this unscripted move. Drew didn't look at the judge first. He didn't look at the jury. He looked at Willow. And in that gaze, she saw the man who used to make her feel safe, the one who had once held her hand and promised her that they could weather anything together. But she also saw the stranger who had made choices that broke her trust, the man whose version of love had started to feel like pressure wrapped in noble intentions. When Drew spoke, his voice was steady, but there was a brittleness beneath it, the kind that comes from someone already standing on the edge with nothing left to lose. He reminded the court of the accusations swirling around them, the insinuations that their romance had been nothing more than a convenient smokescreen, a cover for darker secrets about the shooter and the night everything went wrong. Then, with a few simple words, he pivoted the entire narrative. He asked Willow to marry him again, this time not in private, not in a moment of quiet intimacy, but in front of the judge, the jury, their families, their enemies, and the whole town in spirit. To Drew, this grand gesture was a way to prove that what they had was real. If he could convince the court that their love was genuine, not some elaborate scheme, then the doubts poisoning her case might finally lose their grip. Willow felt the room tilt as if the floor had shifted under her feet. Once upon a time, a proposal from Drew would have filled her with shaky joy, with the sense that life, for all its chaos, might still give her something pure and solid to hold on to. Now the words landed like a weight on her chest. Because the truth, the one she didn't dare speak aloud, is that she wasn't in love with him anymore. The slow unraveling had begun long before the trial, hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully managed conversations, but the crisis had torn away the last comforting illusions. She had watched him make decisions that pushed her into corners, watched him choose control over transparency, watched their bond warp under the pressure of secrets and lies. Yet even as her heart recoiled, another part of her mind began running calculations with ruthless speed. This wasn't just a man asking a woman to give love another chance. This was a defendant and a key witness standing at the center of a narrative the entire town was hungry to judge. If she said yes, it could help them. The optics would be powerful, a couple standing united against a storm of accusations, refusing to let suspicion define them. The jury might soften. The prosecution's story about manipulation and deception might start to look less convincing. Her case, her freedom, her future, the life she still wanted to build for herself and her child, might suddenly look less fragile. That was the cruelest part of it all. Willow's heart might have moved on, but her life had not. She could see the headlines, the social media commentary, the whispered conversations in hospital corridors. She knew how easily people believed what they wanted to believe, especially in a town like Port Charles, where reality and rumor blended until no one could fully separate them. If accepting Drew's proposal could shift public opinion, could tilt the scales just enough in her favor, did she have the right to refuse just because she no longer felt the way she once did? The question gnawed at her. Was this a sacrifice, or self-betrayal? A strategic move, or another step into a life that no longer fit? In the back of the courtroom, Michael Corinthos watched the scene unfold with a fury that built so fast it felt like a physical thing inside his chest. He had arrived expecting another tense day of legal sparring, Another round of listening to attorneys dissect Willow's actions as if she were a case study rather than a person he had once loved and still desperately wanted to protect. What he had not expected was to watch Drew turn the courtroom into a stage for a proposal that felt, to Michael, like emotional blackmail wrapped in a romantic gesture. He could see the conflict written all over Willow's face, the way her eyes glistened with fear rather than joy, the way her shoulders stiffened instead of relaxing. To everyone else, perhaps it looked like a powerful moment of devotion. To Michael, it looked like a cornered woman being offered a gilded cage. Michael's anger didn't come from a single place. It came from layers: old heartbreak, helpless loyalty, his stubborn sense of right and wrong. He had seen the toll this ordeal had taken on Willow, the way she second-guessed every move, the way she carried guilt that wasn't entirely hers to bear. Watching Drew lean into the idea of using marriage as a legal strategy made Michael feel like something inside him snapped. Whether it was jealousy, outrage, or a protective instinct that refused to die, it all poured into the same burning resentment. If Willow accepted, he feared she would shackle herself to a man she no longer trusted just to survive the narrative that had been built around her. If she refused, he feared the fallout would be weaponized against her in court. Either way, she'd lose something. But Michael's rage wasn't just about the engagement. In the days leading up to this moment, he had become increasingly fixated on Harrison Chase and the role the detective's testimony played in all of this. Chase had his own carefully crafted alibi, a timeline that reportedly cleared him of any involvement in the shooting. Yet Michael knew that in Port Charles, even the most airtight alibis could have cracks if you were willing to look hard enough. The idea that Chase might be lying, or protecting someone, had started as a quiet suspicion. Now, as he watched Drew recast the story in front of the judge, that suspicion hardened into a determination to rip apart anything that didn't fit. If Drew was going to gamble with Willow's future by turning their relationship into a public shield, then Michael would counter that move in his own way. He would challenge every piece of the narrative, starting with Chase's. The detective's calm, slightly distant demeanor, his history with Brooklyn, his soft spot for certain people in town, Michael saw connections and motives everywhere he looked. The more he thought about it, the more he felt certain that exposing even one lie could send the prosecution's case spiraling off course. Whether he was reacting to the engagement or whether his rage had simply found a new target, Michael didn't know. He just knew that he couldn't sit still and watch Willow be swallowed by a narrative built on half-truths and strategic alliances. Far from the courtroom, Nina Reeves was waging her own private battle. Next week, she would find herself standing on the edge of a confession she had been avoiding for far too long. Nina knew exactly how people in Port Charles saw her: impulsive, selfish, dangerous with secrets, and the worst part was that sometimes, they were right. She had done terrible things in the past and justified them in the name of love or desperation. But this time, the stakes felt different. This time, the lines between help and harm had blurred so badly that Nina wasn't sure which side of them she was standing on. Somewhere along the way, she had become entangled in the legal strategy surrounding Willow's case. Maybe she had tried to convince herself she was staying out of it, just offering the occasional perspective from the sidelines, but that wasn't the truth. She had weighed in on the idea of a marriage of convenience, on the optics of a united front in court. She had told herself that a strategic union between Drew and Willow might be the best way to shield Willow from the ugliest assumptions, that playing along with this narrative could be a form of protection. But even as she said it, part of her recoiled. What right did she have to help push Willow into a decision that complicated her heart just to clean up the legal mess? And then there was Chase. Nina had quietly leaned on him too, whether she wanted to admit it or not. His access to information, his vantage point inside the investigation, his ability to guide or redirect certain questions, all of it had been tempting. She had taken advantage of his willingness to help, letting herself believe that it was all in service of the truth, or at least in service of something less destructive for Willow. But the more she watched the fallout spread, the more she realized that secrecy had a way of poisoning even the best intentions. If she continued to keep her involvement hidden, she risked becoming exactly what Willow and others had always feared she might be: someone who rearranged people's lives from the shadows and then acted surprised when everything collapsed. So Nina knew that a confession was coming. The only question was who would hear it first. Would she go to Willow, look her in the eye, and admit that she had quietly rooted for the marriage strategy, that she had thought it might help in court even as it threatened to chain Willow to a future she didn't want? Or would she turn to someone else, maybe Chase himself, and acknowledge that she had leaned on him in ways that blurred ethical lines, made requests that were less about justice and more about emotional damage control? Whoever she chose, the confession would cost her something. But Nina had reached the point where silence felt worse than the fallout. Meanwhile, Harrison Chase and Brooklyn Quartermain were on the brink of receiving news that would shatter whatever fragile peace they'd managed to carve out for themselves. For a brief moment, their world had narrowed to something almost simple: shared meals, music, quiet arguments about work-life balance, the comforting rhythm of a relationship built on mutual care instead of chaos. Chase had tried to leave the weight of the investigation at the station door when he came home. Brooklyn, for her part, had done her best to carve out a bubble where he could breathe, where they could exist beyond the latest scandal gripping Port Charles. That bubble burst the moment their phones lit up with simultaneous alerts. A message, a call, a headline, whatever form it took, the effect was the same. The news landed like a shockwave. Somewhere between the legal maneuvering, the whispered strategy, and the personal desperation of everyone involved, Willow and Drew's wedding plans had begun to solidify. Not just as a wild suggestion tossed into the air under pressure, but as a looming reality. An engagement. A potential ceremony. A narrative shift big enough to spin the entire town around. Chase felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Professionally, he knew exactly what this meant. Every move Willow and Drew made would now be dissected through a new lens. Were they acting out of genuine love, or out of fear and calculation? What would it mean for the investigation if their marriage became part of the defense? As someone whose alibi was already drawing scrutiny from certain corners, Michael chief among them, Chase understood that every change in the story could ripple back toward him. And if Nina confessed that she had been leaning on him, even in small ways, to help guide this mess toward a less catastrophic outcome, he would suddenly find himself at the center of a storm he had tried hard to avoid. Brooklyn processed the news with a mix of practicality and dread. On one level, she understood the optics game better than most. She had grown up in a world where public image was currency, where a well-timed photo or a carefully orchestrated event could rewrite the narrative overnight. If Willow and Drew went forward with this wedding, the town would devour every detail: what she wore, who attended, what was said inside and outside the courthouse. There would be sympathy, skepticism, outrage, and intrigue in equal measure. For Forrester Creations or a music label, that kind of buzz could be a goldmine. For real people trapped in a legal quagmire, it could be a disaster. Brooklyn worried not only for Willow but for Chase, for Michael, for all the tangled relationships that would be pulled tighter and tighter until something snapped. She could already picture the fallout: Michael spiraling further into his own crusade, chasing leads to tear apart Chase's alibi or drag hidden alliances into the light, Nina stumbling under the weight of her confession. Willow standing alone at the center of it all, wearing a ring that meant salvation to some and surrender to others. Back in the courtroom, Willow finally drew in a full breath and realized that everyone was waiting on her. Drew's words still hung in the air. The judge's expression was carefully neutral, but there was no denying the curiosity in the room. It wasn't every day that a proposal punctuated a trial. For a long, suspended moment, Willow was acutely aware of her own heartbeat, of the way her life had been reduced to a series of impossible choices. She remembered the warmth of loving Drew once, the comfort of believing that he would never use her vulnerability as leverage. She also remembered every time she'd felt cornered by his decisions, every time she'd swallowed doubts for the sake of harmony. She understood, with painful clarity, that saying yes would not be an answer born out of romance. It would be a move on a chessboard, one she might never be able to undo. Saying no would be an act of self-preservation that could be twisted into something selfish or suspicious, another fact for the prosecution to weave into its story about her character. There was no version where she walked away untouched. In Port Charles, love and strategy had always been intertwined, but now she could feel the full weight of what that truly meant. As the town prepared for the next wave of revelations, as Michael sharpened his determination, Nina steeled herself to tell the truth, and Chase and Brooke Lynn braced for the shock to their own lives. One thing became painfully clear: this wasn't just a story about a proposal in a courtroom. It was about how people used love, real or broken, present or past, as armor, as currency, as proof. It was about what happens when survival and emotion collide, when hearts become evidence, and vows become tactics. And hovering over it all was the one question none of them could yet answer: in the end, would this desperate attempt to prove that love was stronger than suspicion save Willow, or simply bind her tighter to a life built on compromise and fear?